Hello, everybody. It's time to start here. We really don't have much time, actually, in more ways than one.
Okay.
Hi, I'm Richard. Well, it says up there, I'm Richard Edmonds. I teach part-time in the Geographical Studies program here at the University of Chicago, and most of my work has been for a long time on China and environmental problems. That better? Okay, I'll try and talk up louder. Yeah, most of my work has been on China and environmental problems. So what I'll try to do is go through this as quickly as possible and open it up to questions, because you had already some good questions connected with China. Simply put, I'll try and talk a bit about a few just comparative slides, and then China's problems that it actually sees itself as facing from climate change, and then a bit about the international regime that goes around that. Okay? All right, so some of this, I just had a peek at some of the material you've got. Also, I apologize for my slides. First of all, they're all stolen from everybody else, and I'm not a very snazzy slide doer, but they'll have to do. I took a peek at some of your materials, and you have a lot of these things actually in some of those handouts from other people with reference to China, so that's a good thing that you have. Here, this is World Resources Institute's done this in 2006. It's showing China as having lower carbon emissions. As you probably know, the Dutch now say that China has already surpassed the United States to become the biggest producer. Who knows? It doesn't really matter, because it's going to happen sooner rather than later. And estimates up there at the top about what kind of greenhouse gas emissions China's likely to be putting out, reaching up to close to a third by 2020, all right? Much of what I'll be talking about, I'll try and talk more in terms of the very, very big picture of 2050 and what the Chinese are viewing. But of course, as you know, with any kind of predictions, let me start everything up by saying all these statistics are lies, and the predictions are all very sketchy because of a massive size of China. You can imagine there are problems with statistics collecting, despite the fact that they've gotten much, much better over time. And predictions either have to be linear or they have to be scenario-based. So I'm taking kind of the general view, okay? So that's the best we can do at this time, I think. Here you have some emissions picture, which pretty much shows you the obvious. The red there, China, growing very rapidly since about 1980, 1978, when it initiated its economic reform program, and still continuing at a higher clip than the emissions from the USA. And of course, 2002, it seems to be a lot lower. Those figures are probably a lot closer to each other now. This, which is kind of hard to read, lays out GDP growth, which you also see taking off very strongly since 1981. When it's put per capita, it drops because of China's still growing population. And we'll come back to one so-called one-child policy a bit later. There's a lot we can say about that. There's a whole lecture all in and of itself. And then you have your emissions of CO2 and cement, fossil fuel and cement there by per capita again, which is much, much lower than the overall. And you see the population growth, which in terms of if you view China as a developing country, and we'll talk a little about that later, whether it's a developed country or a developing country. The government has been known to say both when it was to their advantage to do so, as would any government. It's a very modest population growth.
How is cement related to fossil fuel?
It produces carbon dioxide. In that sense, it's related to fossil fuel. Yeah, the manufacture of cement produces greenhouse emissions. Okay. Now here you have a per capita, which we all, I guess, really know. It shows you maybe why the United States, and to a lesser degree Australia, have been reluctant to sign a lot of protocols in this area. And China's down there. The figure about China's per capita runs from 1/8 to 1/5, depending on who you're talking to. The Chinese particularly like the 1/8 figure. A lot of Western organizations like 1/6 and 1/5, someplace in that area. And anyway, the point is here, there's a lot of room for growth. And also, I'd like to point out, as I will in a couple of slides, there's a lot of room for growth in several other rather large countries, and even a lot of small countries. Okay. This one shows, and these are not quite up to date, but the big picture hasn't changed at all. You have CO2 emissions here in terms of energy. You see coal dominates this tremendously. Even if you throw in hydro and nuclear, and that is often, as we'll see, talked about in terms of China as being renewables. Anyway, a bit about coal is, by estimates in China, it's got about 200 years worth of reserves of coal. So coal is plentiful in the big picture of China. There are regional problems with that coal and quality problems. The north has a lot of good quality coal. The south has not very much, rather poor quality coal. So China spends a lot of energy and creates a lot of pollution and greenhouse gases moving coal from North China to South China through the rather strained railway network. The natural gas, oil is, there is some exploration going on offshore for Chinese oil and in the northwest of China, both with technical problems and distance hauling problems. China's oil is not about to grow. And then natural gas, which is often associated with coal and is seen as a very desirable burning fuel by the Chinese, probably more for its polluting element than for greenhouse gas element connections, is not growing. It's stagnant. So China, if I gave this lecture, and I used to lecture on these kind of things about 1990, 1994, you could just talk about Chinese internal production of these products, and you had the whole picture. Of course, now we'd have to talk about it in international perspective with the purchase of so many energy resources. In terms of, we hear a lot, you'll see a lot, particularly in Africa, that China is kind of invading Africa. And there's been, I think, in America and in Europe to some degree too, a political game has been made of this kind of development. If you see actually what China is doing in Africa, it is growing. Its resource extraction is growing tremendously. Angola now is the #1 exporter of oil. It's passed up Saudi Arabia as the #1 exporter of oil to China. So there's been some big changes there. But basically, China's gone into countries, that the Western majors didn't want to go into for security reasons, or they have gone in a lot of times into patches that Western companies let go because they didn't think they were profitable. So, and if you actually see the amount of oil that's hauled out of Africa, China is still a relatively small player compared to most of the European and North American oil firms. So that is something you have to keep in mind when you hear all that talk about oil. China's population is estimated at about 1.3 billion now. We expect it to become 1.5 billion by 2050. So that's still 200 million people. That's a lot of people. But it must be said that if without the one-child policy, there would be a lot more people and hence a lot more problems with pollution and with fossil fuel extraction. One other thing I want to stress about, here we go, thank heavens. About one-child policy, something you should note, it really isn't a one-child policy. It is a policy that allows people to have only one child if they're in an urban area and rural areas because of problems with female infanticide and also serious social problems such as like no social welfare net. They've expanded it. You really can have 2 children in rural areas. Minority peoples in theory are exempt, which sometimes works as exempt, but there's sometimes some arm twisting in minority areas that goes on. So that's kind of about that. Okay, GDP per capita, you see it's supposed to reach US $10,000. That figure of 1,702 for more or less these days is you get figures even going up to $3,000, and then there's purchase parities, which make it difficult to really compare. But in any event, the Chinese per capita will grow. What you need to know in China is even more so these days, and it's very ironic being a so-called communist country, the income gaps now are larger than they are in the United States. You're talking about some really people who are quite rich, certainly a lot richer than I am giving this lecture, and others who are completely dirt poor. Although I must admit, when I've traveled in rural areas in China, I've very rarely come to a village that doesn't at least have basic electricity. And I did some research in the Gambia at a time, and it was hard to find some of the rural villages that had any electricity. So in that sense, it isn't quite as poor as some other areas. Energy consumption, though, expected to double in coal equivalent between now and 2050. So that's a big problem. Government reports for that kind of long period, they're thinking of an increase of 2.2 degrees centigrade in general temperature in China, which is a lot higher than a lot of other people say, but that's what they're estimating. Precipitation overall increase at 7%, you can see there. And yield reductions. Some people are estimating more like 10% loss or 7%, but they actually have Chinese are actually working on a figure of 37%, which I think is a little high. And then an increase at the same time in desertified lands. Now, the first thing, as a geography teacher, I should tell you is this doesn't apply all the same all over the country, okay? And we'll get to that in a moment. Also, we're going to see 85% reduction of permafrost islands on the plateau, and a drop in glaciers, which has already started. There's a Tibetan who looks a little strange here, but actually that's because he's sitting on a yak. It doesn't show up very well there. That path, this is 2005, that used to be a glacier, and he's now, you can see it isn't a glacier anymore there. In the lake shrinkage expected, in reverse, coastal sea level rises and flooding, and this is kind of interesting. If the normal prediction goes, they're expecting if the area that's below 4 meters is flooded, there'll be an area about the size of the country of Portugal that will be lost by 2050. And more important than that, like China's really, has been until very recently, an agriculture country. Its major cities have been located along waterways, and several of them, such as Shanghai and Guangzhou in Guangdong province, are right on the, more or less on the coast. Guangzhou is a little bit inland, but we're expecting the sea level rise to be particularly strong in the southern part of China, down where Guangzhou is. So you're going to have 67 people that you're going to have to either move, or somebody is going to, the effort to build seawalls here is going to be tremendous and very difficult. Also,
is that the area of the Pearl River Delta?
that's the Pearl River Delta where Guangzhou is, and then Shanghai is at the Chang or Yangtze River Delta.
So it's really the most important industrial area, too.
Both of those two are the most important industrial areas, Shanghai being also extremely important. They are by far the most important ones. So yeah, it's not just people, it's best quality land, major urban areas, and a lot of industry. And the core of what's driving Chinese economy at this particular point in time. So it's very, very disconcerting, isn't it? Fish yields already in the Chang or Yangtze River, which is the one that flows into Shanghai. They have, in the summer, couple of months, you have had fishing bans for about 3 or 4 years because the fish yields are down. They're expecting them to go down further. The heat will cause either heat stroke or the reverse of that, a lot of air conditioning use. And one way or the other, it's going to be a problem. And of course, infectious disease and weed and pest increases, because they will grow as well in the warmer climate. Big picture though, North China, which is dry, experiencing water shortages. I don't know if you know, the Chinese government took on what I call the Great Wall mentality. It's trying to solve the water shortages in the Beijing and Tianjin area up in the north by just digging a few little canals, one all the way from central China, about 1,000 kilometers long, to the Beijing-Tianjin area, and then another to pump water up the Grand Canal, a very polluted waterway, so I don't know that I want to drink the water anyhow, but with 13 major pumping stations, pump it north along the east coast. And then another one, which they haven't even started yet, and environmentalists generally are hoping they never do, is to blast holes in mountains way up in Shanghai and direct the upper flow across into the north. And that may work out okay in a weird sort of way if South China does get wetter and experiencing more and more flooding in coastal zones. If you look at China's flood problems, I mean, which I'd say everybody's right now preoccupied with flood problems here. With the monsoonal climate, flooding can be very unpredictable. But over the last 100 years, we've seen a shift. Most of the flooding was on the Huang or Yellow River. These days, due to water shortages and drought up in the north already, the river often has not been flowing out to sea. It is in Shandong province, hundreds of kilometers away, it just dries up in many summers. They're very proud the last couple of years they've got it flowing again. But I mean, that's how serious water shortages are in the north. But if you check the flood records, major flooding is now happening in the south. And the south has become a flood area where there really wasn't that much of a problem before. And this exasperates old problems, because the south, the Pearl River and the Yellow or Huang River are totally opposite. The Pearl River is a fast-flowing river, and the Huang River is more or less a mud flow. It really isn't even a river. And now, of course, we've got this situation going to be made worse. They're predicting. Not everything's bad. There are some good sides to this, possibly. They're predicting the forest productivity is going to go up. A lot of areas where they have deciduous, coniferous tree forests, they'll be able to plant deciduous. Even with the aridity, certain areas where there's more rainfall, they're expecting to get better grassland productivity in certain areas. And of course, the river discharges are going to increase in the south, which at certain times of the year will be very useful. And the northeast, which is, we often call it Manchuria. Manchuria tends to have very good Chernism black earth. So this area could become a major breadbasket. Okay, well, obviously energy uses are going to be increasing with all of this.
Did you say that about Manchuria again? I kind of got distracted.
It's a very, very rich, fertile area. Okay, so
yeah, that's fine. We'll hear you better.
It's a very, very kind of rich, fertile area, and it has Chernism soil. That's kind of sort of Edmonds plains, will be some of the best soil types in the world. But it's kind of cold, so with the warming, they're actually going to have better potential for crop yield. Okay. Now they talk about solving energy problems. Of course, you're going to have a lot of air conditioning and all that, but most of their energy problems are talking about solving from renewables. So the Chinese idea of renewables is largely hydroelectric power, which comes from the plants. And that has environmental consequences, some of which we are already seeing in this earthquake that just happened, and then there's a possibility for more of that too, connected with the frequency data that come, we'll have to see. And then the other big renewable, number two, which China's going into in a big way, is nuclear, which also isn't exactly environmentally most friendly place to go about it. But whenever these two are criticized inside China, people say, okay, you don't want a big dam, we'll build 12 coal-fired power plants. Do you want the sulfur dioxide, or do you want possibly some kind of sail to die out for the ecosystem? And the government, also many of the government leaders have been hydrological engineers, component of hydrological engineering. And also political terms. As John Denis says in his 73 Workers' Day, only a country with a party as strong as the Communist Party could develop something like this wall mentality. We need a strong state that can do these kind of things. So that, is another reason why. And it looks good. It looks like you're really doing something, and it's really seeable, so it's really big. At the same time, there's a lot of going on with wind and wave power and solar power. But there tend to be small projects, and the numbers are going up quite rapidly, but in the big picture of China's energy needs, it's very small. Okay, tourism, they're expecting, they have nature reserves, and those, some are really well managed, some not so well managed, that's another story. But they're expecting those to be affected by climate change, and that could affect, many of them have tourist areas connected with them for revenue generating, that could cause a problem. Oh, the foreigners want to get on the Qinghai-Tibetan Railway, it's kind of neat, it's the world's highest railway and everything just completed and everything. But you remember I mentioned about that permafrost melt? They were worried about whether it was going to work with no permafrost melt, because nobody's built railways much on permafrost before. With this melt, this railway may become a sinking white elephant. Okay? So what's the government think about all this? And it's taken this kind of hard line in international relations, which it makes a lot of sense. It's not really reasonable for China to be expected to deal with all these problems. We're a developing country, and by pulling that card, they've been able to lead, along with India to some degree, the developing community. I think you probably know all of that already. They also make the historical argument, which is very effective. The countries of Western and Central Europe and North America have accounted for 50% of the greenhouse gas emissions that are out there already. If we look over the last 200 years, China amounts for 8%, and the lowest, the poorest 50 countries, who the China is claiming to protect, account for about 0.5%. So, who should be cleaning all of this up? Still, China went ahead and did a lot of things. One of the most amazing things, I think, was it was the first country, period, to adopt an Agenda 21. I was actually involved in a European Union mission to China in the 1990s. And it was more like a shopping list, really, than a particular agenda. They had projects on there for everybody, everything from alleviating the problems of women in Xinjiang all the way through to chemical changes of water composition, the whole range. They wanted you to pick and choose. And that was another political story I really can't tell you now, but the EU is as mystical in dealing with that as the Chinese were.
I'm not familiar with the term Agenda 21.
Agenda 21 was an agenda that was put together to control environmental problems and for the 21st century. Okay. And different countries were supposed to put one of those together, and China was the first one to do it. Then, of course, it went into, for climate change, in 1994, it ratified that in Kyoto Protocol in 1997, and it was easy for them to do it because they got themselves classified as a developing country. And back in those days, it probably more than today, that was a fair assessment. And China didn't like the fact that the U.S. withdrew from it and has fought against that quite hard. Sees the United States as neglecting its responsibilities here. Now, inside China, they've created their own climate change. The State Council is kind of like an advisory group that really has more power certainly than the People's Congress inside of China. So it's a big thing to be set up from them. Since 2003, the National Development and Reform Commission's been put in charge. That's the new term for what used to be the State Planning Commission. As the state plan has shrunk, it's now down to about 20% of the economy. The State Planning Commission decided it needed to get itself into another business. And so it got into this kind of development business. And so they are now taking over running these kind of things, as well as what remains of the state plan. And this last year, China created its own China Claim Change program. This is kind of interesting. You can see in China's emissions are being cut through their own process as they state it, pretty much at the same level as the United States in comparison to the European Union, which has been much more strict on this sort of thing. Clean development mechanism, I believe you've had some talk about this. This is a way, and this is where finally the U.S. and China were able to come together, since the U.S. didn't seem to want to do anything, and China didn't want to do anything either. But by this kind of way of doing things, actually the U.S. and indeed other countries put money into China and then buy themselves carbon credits in this kind of fashion. And China has almost half of the world's clean development mechanisms, projects in the country. And the vast majority are going into renewable energy, although people who know more about this than I do say fuel substitution is the one that will get them the best bang for the buck. Afforestation, reforestation is something that China has been doing for their own reasons for years and years, and therefore it makes sense it's a low priority. Also, I know that the United States personally has been very heavily involved in the coal bed methane projects. They've done a lot of work there. Here's where we get to the big fun problems. Carbon problems are one thing, and then you have pollution is another matter. China's been facing pollution for quite some time. And throughout the whole period that China has really been working on this seriously, which is from the mid-1980s on, China has placed first priority on water pollution, second priority on air pollution, third on waste, and the noise almost gets nothing in terms of money and dealing. And the reasoning for the difference between air and water is a kind of, they see it as directly connected to health. It's something China is scarce on. It's also something that's easier for them to manage. And also the effects of pollution, the poisoning has showed up quicker. Air kind of blows away, becomes somebody else's problem or something. So more of their money has gone into that. So when we're talking about greenhouse gas emission, first of all, you have to balance that against China's serious kind of pollution problems. And China's doing a lot of work on air pollution. They're putting in scrubbers, which are controlling particulate, and trying to control their sulfur out of their coal with coal washing, all these. They got all those kind of projects going on, and that's all really good stuff. But it isn't really dealing with the greenhouse gas side of things. So that's a competing thing. Then lay on top of that the water question, which is huge because, as I pointed out already, there's scarcity, but there's also serious. All of China's rivers are polluted, all of them. It's just a matter of more polluted than others. It's a very, very serious problem. So they got that. Then on top of that, you have economic growth matters. Now, this is a divided country. The coastline is as wealthy almost as Japan, It's really doing very well. Anybody who's been to Beijing, Shanghai, and Guangzhou knows that. All right, you don't have to go too far into the interior, and you really are in a developing country. So China isn't lying when it says it is a developing country, and it isn't lying when it says it's developed. It's two countries really, and you have you have a system where people are registered by where they live, and they get a what's called a hukou, a registration as urban or rural. So they also have this kind of situation where people aren't really allowed technically to move to urban areas. Now that's loosened up and they can get there, because before everything was rationed and you could go, and the only way you could get any food was if you had a relative who would give you some or something. And that's all loosened up. But you go and you're now it's a wonderful situation. It reminds me of America. They're like illegal immigrants, except that they're domestic ones. And they're eminently exploitable. And so all these people who are cleaning up computer waste and all that rubbish on the east coast of China, they're not Easterners. They're people who come in from Sichuan in the southwest and do that work. Very, very dangerous work kind of thing. So you have that all going on, so that's a big social problem. But you also have this desire for growth. And therefore you have a central government that's trying to demand some of these things and trying to do these things as best they can. You've got provincial and local governments that have absolutely no interest in it. Right? So you can see this dilemma. How that's going to work out is anybody's guess. And that, of course, calls into question the idea of the rule of law. Climate change agenda. Well, it's being driven a bit by disasters, but actually, of course, this most recent disaster is seen as an earthquake, as an earthquake problem, which isn't really climate change. There's always been always talk in China about turning back to agriculture. This reminds me a bit of the Americans talking about the family farm, American politicians. But in China, there's a view that agriculture is crucial because they've always wanted to be able to feed themselves, and it's kind of a dependency issue. I mean, Japan even went through this and finally gave up, and China may have to do the same. But the infrastructure has fallen down. There was a period in the 80s and 90s when China was and still is in a way transitioning from a totalitarian communism kind of state to this kind of authoritarian market-oriented state. And so in some ways, China's had the worst of communism and the worst of capitalism going on at the same time. Because you had this kind of like rigid sort of state bureaucratic system still sitting there, but then you had all of this kind of Dickinson kind of novel exploitation of people going on at the same time. So I don't know. In agriculture, anyway, the turn back will be to talk of infrastructure improvements. Infrastructure fell apart. In the old days, you just told the peasants, go do it. The party says you're going to do this. They would do that. Now they have to try and pay them and cajole them to go, and people don't do it, and the officials want to make off with the money and buy a car, this kind of thing. So the infrastructure in the agricultural areas fell into kind of a sad state. Biotechnology, big thing here is, of course, this brings up another environmental matters, genetically modified food, and organisms, which China is going to be a leader in, much to the horror of the European Union. And then there's talk of large-scale plantation agriculture. That also scares me. I mean, have a look at Iowa. This is not necessarily the way to go, but I think they see that by doing this, they can save at least on energy use and maximize things that way. But of course, you have monoculture has its own problems brought with it. Flood and drought measures, these will have to continue should we go on. But again, they say these things quite often. Local governments to face the issue. This is a big problem. Local government, getting the local government to listen to what the provincial government and central governments say. That's why people who go to do business in China say, oh, Beijing said I couldn't do it. So you go to the province. Province says I can't do it. Go to the county. Maybe the county. One of those levels, somebody's going to say you can do it. And most likely it's going to be at the county. But in terms of practicalities here, they've chosen two groups of provinces to concentrate on. Tibet and Qinghai are on the plateau. And Ningxia is an arid Muslim, it's technically a Muslim autonomous region, although less than half the population is Muslim, that just to the northwest where there's arid and humid climate coming together. So those are sensitive areas, so they want to concentrate on that. Shanxi and Inner Mongolia, those two provinces in the second bunch, are China's main coal mining provinces, and they're in North China. Hebei is the one that surrounds Beijing. That always gets top priority because it's affecting where the politicians are. Revegetation policies. They've been doing a lot. China's done a lot of revegetation. Sometimes you even begin to wonder whether revegetation is the best thing for the environment here. But they're going to have to change. They are already changing crop and tree species to match up with where they think the climate's going. Okay? Coastal protection, obviously, from what I've said before, you know. And the others are just kind of things you'd expect. Reduce energy intensity is easy to say, going to be difficult. Here's another slide I stole some from somebody else, which is why it looks better. But here's some things. Coal proportion of total primary energy below 50%. This is where we start talking about goals. China hasn't been real good lately on meeting its goals. And if we're talking about it being about 75% now, that's a massive amount. And also with the energy use doubling, I don't see how they can do that. So you can getting a picture now from me. This is a kind of pessimistic picture. And it's not fair in some ways because China's really, there are a lot of people really trying hard to deal with these issues. But they're big issues, really big, massive. And then you have nuclear and renewable. Well, the nuclear is really on target. They're working on that. And renewable, they're working on it, but they're working from, as I said, from a very slow base. Hydrogen power, I'm told by people here that we're 20, 30 years out ourselves from having the technology to be able to move everything sort of in hydropower, that it isn't there yet. So that, you know, is counting on a technology developing very rapidly in the next few years. Good luck. I really hope it happens. But it's, you see, I don't know that you can really count on that. How are we doing in time? Let's see. Now, so far we've had some energy efficiency taking place in China, a lot of it, but a lot of it has been China moving up the food chain. You know, the politicians still yell about Chinese junk. Actually, the junk seems to be coming more and more from elsewhere, and the more high-end goods are coming from China, and therefore your energy intensity looks better because the products you're manufacturing cost more, and so you're getting more value for your kilowatt of energy. And that has probably been more the reason that the energy efficiency has been looked, as much as there has been improvement in energy efficiency, but that's helped it a lot, okay? But as I said, goals have not been met, okay? Price raising, well, China just did raise its price for oil, but China isn't, you know, the economy in China is not in particularly good shape right now in some ways either, although we may think it is. There's a massive amount of inflation. People are clamoring about the price of food, which has gone up very, very rapidly. So this is a worry. Let's see. We can expect slowed growth, and you've had other people talk about that. At the world scale, I don't see any reason why that would be any different here. Poorer health. This means not necessarily in provision of health care, but you know there are reasons why there would be poorer health. I already talked about the clean development. So it's going to have to move to more and more to economic incentives instead of using top-down commands. Now that's, first of all, China's been doing that for the last 10 years, a lot. They're using much more economic incentives, but they have little problems with that. For instance, in terms of fining, this I know mostly from pollution rather than from things connected directly with greenhouse gas, but the problem will be the same. The fines have been too low, and it's been easier for people to continue to pollute rather than clean it up. And there's been collusion, of course, too. Sometimes there's collusion. But further than that, oftentimes the salaries of the local environmental protection agencies are very low. And the way they actually pay for the environmental protection agency is through the fine fees. So if you have everybody clean up the environment, you've got no more fees. Therefore, you can't pay yourself. So it's not sometimes it's not to the very, very local environmental protection agency's advantage to clean everything up, because that would be, that would put them out of business. So they work out this kind of figure which is below what it's going to, cost to really fix things, and everybody's kind of happy except for the environment. Okay, and then we have this water pollution investment versus greenhouse and air, which I talked about before already. Now, in the last few years, we've seen something very interesting happening in China. We talk about the Great Wall. We can also talk about the Great Firewall, which is supposed to have been put in place by the Chinese to kind of control what flows on the internet. But there are many very clever bloggers in China who know how to use proxies and run around to different places and keep sending messages, and information gets out. And throughout the 90s and the last few years, we've had protests about pollution conditions and so-called natural disasters that people thought were really caused by incompetence in the government and things of that sort. And the information is getting out. 2004, this is on the Huang River. This says we don't want pollution, we want to live. These kind of protests, people are now willing to take them on. In this year, not in this area, but in eastern China, there was a pollution event where crops were dying and people were dying. So they'd had enough from 13 factories that were near it, and the local government said clean it up. The government said, yeah, we'll do that, but of course they didn't because I don't know why. Probably they were on the take or they wanted the tax revenue or whatever. And so they actually tried to shut the place down and put a bunch of old ladies on the road to block the police coming in. And the idiot police backed into one of them and ran one over. And I think they killed her, but not seriously injured her. And the whole town got so angry, they actually beat up the police and threw them out of the town. That's the first time anybody in China has been able to launch that kind of attack. Plus reporters in China, who are very brave souls, got it into the papers. And they lost their jobs in the process, but they got it into the papers. And, the government couldn't really send in thugs or whatever to crack heads. So it was a difficult situation for them. And this is now getting out, and it's getting around China. Other interesting events, pollution factories in big cities, protests. They sometimes have been broken up. Shanghai had one. The city of Xiamen down the southeast had a huge one. And people think of clever ways to get around it. You're not allowed to protest. We're not protesting. We're taking a walk. San San Boo. There were only 5,000 people walking right in front of a factory, back and forth. They couldn't do too much about it, especially if they got large enough numbers. So this is something that's coming along. Yes?
One of the economics teachers at a college near us has said recently he thinks when the Olympics are over in Beijing, you will see the government really cracking down on this. They just don't want to do it now because they don't want the bad news.
Cracking down on what?
On protests.
Well, they're basically keeping as many people out of Beijing as they can, in that sense.
But they're going to get harsh and he thinks once the Olympics are over.
If there are protests that come out after that, that is quite possible. Yeah, that's quite possible. Yeah. It depends on what you're doing and how much. A limited amount may be okay, but they will crack down. I mean, what we know now, Tibet has kind of fallen off of the newspaper agenda, and now we're seeing hearing of a lot of crackdown in Tibet at this particular point in time. So we have this at the same. So we have popular this kind of a thing against the idea that we can't have this kind of chaos because China is too big. It's going to you can understand the argument that people in the government would use for that. So they would try and increase control. And we have this attempt by Beijing to insert its power more into the local areas. And they're having some success with that, but it's not going along far enough. Would all this lead to the breakup of China? I doubt it. China has a very national, unified mentality. I know what you're saying. You're thinking, but what about Tibet? What about Xinjiang? Well, Xinjiang, the Uyghurs and Tajik and other people are a minority already. There's a majority of mainstream Han Chinese there, which would make it very difficult. And Tibet as well doesn't really have kind of the resources to launch an independence movement. I would think it'd be very difficult unless China itself changes its attitude towards Tibet. And the attitude due to education and lots of other nationalism, lots of other reasons, is very much resistant to that. And I was very touched by the Chinese press pulling up this article about a group of Polynesians occupying the Hawaiian governor's mansion or the museum and declaring Hawaii was supposed to be independent, and they thought this was just quite jolly because in some ways it is a very similar situation to Tibet if you want to take that kind of view a little bit further down the line. So you get those kind of fun things. They also issue a white paper, actually, the Chinese do, because the U.S. issues one on China on human rights. They issue a white paper on American human rights, which is a lot of fun to read too. Anyhow, then the one-child policy that was put in effect in 1978 to last 30 years. There was talk this year they were going to stop it. They said no. I expect that to continue for quite some time, especially as we see it is viewed as a part of a problem of what China can carry in capacity of people. If China gets wealthier, it will do like other wealthy countries, and it will export its emissions to other countries, i.e. buy more and more things from other countries that will have to deal with the pollution and cleanup. Okay? Any questions? Maybe that was too much and too off. Anything? Yeah, you're welcome. Sorry about the projector. Yes.
Well, what's the hope? It looks hopeless to me.
Yeah, it is.
As far as greenhouse gases are concerned, I can't see much. They're doing something, but it appears that the problem is so gigantic that you can't really expect much in the next 10 or 12 years.
I think you can, in the next 10 or 12 years, yeah, you may be right. I think that they're moving in the right, let's put it this way, things are moving in the right direction on lots of fronts. But to meet the kind of goals that we're expecting is going to be very, very difficult. So I mean, it's really all I can say about it. I think it is, I'm fairly pessimistic about it. But that isn't for lack of trying.
Well, they seem to be trying harder than we are.
At this point in time, I would think you're right. There's been a lot of movement for environmental education. They have NGOs, and they have this wonderful thing too called GONGOs, which are government-organized, non-governmental organizations, which is a wonderful term. And but these people know how far they can push the system, and they do it, and they also know sort of what they should be doing. And sometimes actually the foreign NGOs give them a problem because the foreign NGOs come in with money and they have another agenda which can get them in trouble and then ruins what they're doing.
If they have 1/6 our per capita output, and yet there's, well, what I've read many times, it doesn't go along with what you said, but what I've read many times is that they have 7% more total output than we do. It just, I mean, that just sounds hopeless.
Oh, I think the total output of what? Of
Carbon dioxide.
oh, I said I think that statistic's out of date. The Dutch release shows that they now have probably already have surpassed this. Yes. Well, there's leapfrogging we can hope for, i.e., and this China has done, and certainly in pollution. Rather than deal with old factories, they leave those alone, but they're very stringent about new factories for pollution control. So what we can hope, and in fact it's happening to a large extent, new infrastructure. Like for instance, all this talk about they're building a coal-fired power plant every week or something like this. You will hear these kind of statements, which is true. But those are a lot more efficient and cleaner than the coal-fired power plants they were building in the 1960s. So, you know, it doesn't necessarily mean it's going to grow geometrically. It's going to grow.
It's mean that if they don't actually sequester what comes out of these coal-fired power plants, even greater efficiency with one coming out every week can hardly be very hopeful.
I can't argue with you on that one. That's why I'm somewhat pessimistic about it. On that jolly note.